we've got the recording going. And this is the area that the Bodhisattva headed to, and this is where he practiced for years, and this is the area associated with that Upanishadic tradition where Yajnavalkya was a great ancestral teacher. And when the Bodhisattva became the Buddha, he flipped around, and instead of teaching Atman, which was what all his teachers were doing, all his fellow students, co-students were doing, he turns around and he teaches An-Atman, not Atman. So we talked about the background of that last week, and tonight we're going to go into, in particular, his understanding of in Pali Anatta, in Sanskrit An-Atman, not self. We're going to do it by looking in particular at the 5 aggregates, the Pancha Khanda. Now, if you know anything about the Buddha's teaching, you've probably heard of the 5 aggregates. The 5 aggregates is one of the 2 basic ways in which the Buddha looks at the human condition and analyzes it and talks about how it works and what to do about it and so on. You have the 5 aggregates and the 6 sense fields. And tonight we're talking about the 5 aggregates. Maybe some other time we can talk about the 6 sense fields. Now, these 5 aggregates, the Buddha introduces in his first discourse. This is Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, turning the Dharma wheel. And he presents this as the essence of the first truth, that of dukkha, which I'm sure you've all heard, usually translated suffering. And dukkha is a technical term, and it's got a much wider range of meaning than just suffering. In fact, there's no exact English equivalent. So if you look at this word, this is a compound word made up of ka, where ka is empty space, and du, the prefix, which indicates bad, difficult, painful, and so on. So dukkha is the painful emptiness that we find at the center of our being. So the sense of chronic dis-ease that motivates us to make things better. So dukkha is the source of our motivation. So our motivation to undertake the practice, our motivation to undertake any activity that we think will improve our condition. So the Buddha begins there, and he analyzes the nature of dukkha from the most superficial to the deepest. And he sums it up at the deepest level of dukkha. He says, in summary, the 5 aggregates associated with clinging are dukkha. So if we're talking about the 5 aggregates, we need to talk about dukkha. There's a close connection between them, and the connection is clinging. And in Pali, this is upadana. Now, of course, it's one of the problems that we have, that we approach the Dharma in English. So we think that the Buddha is talking about clinging or attachment, and it may come as a statement of the bleeding obvious, but it could also come as a surprise to realize that nowhere ever in his teaching, in his career, does the Buddha ever mention the word clinging, and he never mentions the word attachment. And the reason why is obvious: he didn't speak English. So what he talked about was upadana. So let's have a look at this word. So it's a compound word made up of dana, upadana. Now this dana is exactly the dharma, the dana that Tammy was talking about. It means gift or giving. And then you have the prefix a. A means toward, this direction. And then you have upa, which indicates intimacy. Upa a dana. So to bring or give toward oneself. So not to give, which is going this direction, but to take this direction. And upa suggests intimacy. So upadana is taking or bringing to oneself. So making one's own, appropriation. So basically, upadana, that we translate as clinging, sometimes as attachment, refers to taking as one's own. So for example, we have the 5 aggregates, which is a list. First item in the list is body, rupa. Does it make sense to you to think in terms of this is my body? Does it make sense to you to speak in terms of this is my body? Does it make sense to you to act in terms of this is my body? Do you ever do that? Well, this action of taking as mine is upadana. Does that make sense? And do you get a sense of just, it's like sometimes people talk about, oh, clinging, attachment, oh, you mustn't cling, you mustn't be attached. As if, okay, I can stop doing it now. The very thought, oh, I can stop doing it now, is upadana. So it goes very deep, and it's just part of nature. It's, it's not this fluffy little thing floating at the top. So upadana, and then we have khandha, 5 aggregates, the khandhas. So what does khandha mean? Khandha indicates a mass of something, so a huge thing of something, and in particular, a great collection of something. So for example, a pile of sand is a khandha. It's one big thing. It's a pile of sand. But it consists of many smaller units, so each individual grain of sand. So a whole collection, khandha, of sand indicates a mass of sand, a khandha. But you notice that in this example, what connects the parts to make the whole are very loosely connected. So a pile of sand is easily scattered. And this is one of the associations of this word khandha. So khandha indicates a mass of something, a great collection of something, and taken as a collection, khandha can also indicate a category of something. So for example, we have a pile of sand and it sits on a beach. So everything here that could be categorized as sand, both the pile itself and what surrounds the pile, is collected into the khandha, beach. So if you look at the 5 khandhas, the first one is body, the body khandha. So that indicates the whole collection, the whole mass of experiences that we can categorize as body, as physical. Does that make sense? And you notice that with this concept, and at the Buddha's time, the people hearing this would pick up on this immediately, that what holds all this together is actually very loose. It's not really tight at all, because we don't get that so much. Then we have the 5 aggregates, the pancha khandha. Now this is a list, and of course if you're familiar with the Buddha's teaching, you know the Buddha is very fond of a good list, and I think he was probably extremely proud of this one. So this is a list. It consists of body, feeling, perception, choices, awareness. So these are the 5 categories, khandha, of experience. And each one of these categories, khandha, contains a great collection, khandha, of individual experiences that can be placed in each one of these categories. And why are these particular categories so important? They're the categories of experience that we appropriate as this is mine. And why is appropriation important? Because appropriation for the Buddha is an essential aspect of Atman, of self. And this is where the Buddha begins his critique of the teaching of self, of Atma. So if we think about what do we mean by self? So last week we talked about in the Indian tradition at the time, the metaphysical self, the psychological self, and the Buddha focuses on the psychological self. Self is the one who possesses a body and a mind. Self is the one who possesses his or her actions and who therefore is morally responsible for his or her actions, because these actions belong to him or her. So self is the person to whom it makes sense to refer to my body, my mind, my actions, my life. Does anybody here ever find themselves thinking in these terms? Have you done that before? So, and for the Buddha, and this is where he parts company with his contemporaries. For the Buddha, self is something we construct. It's not something already given. Now, in the Upanishads, it's the opposite. Self is the already given primary. Self is the starting point from which the multiplicity of the world proceeds. So if you think about your experience right now, what are you experiencing? Are you experiencing seeing? A collection of things you're seeing. Hearing? A collection of things you're hearing. Smelling, tasting, touching, minding. Are you experiencing all sorts of different things? In other words, is there a multiplicity out there that you are experiencing? So we have this sense of the world of multiplicity. There's a lot happening. And at the other end, we have a unitary point, me, who's experiencing this. So this is the nature of experience. And for the Upanishads, self, the one who experiences, this is the foundation. But this is the already given primary. This is the starting point from which the multiplicity of the world proceeds. This is the basic part of the basic doctrine. The Buddha reverses that. For him, what's given are the collection of individual events that make up the multiplicity of the world. That's what's real for him. And from that, we infer a unitary self. But the self, for the Buddha, is not what is actually given in experience. It's an assumption, it's an inference, it's a projection. So do you see the difference there between the Buddha and his contemporaries? Both have this sense of there's a multiplicity of the world and there's a unitary point where all this is experienced. In the Upanishads, they say, well, this is what's real and this is not so real. And the Buddha reverses it. He says, no, actually the reality is here. It's this point, which is not real. This is how he's so radical within that context. He's flipping over. It's like he's tossed over the whole chessboard. We're not going to play by these rules. We're going to play by these other rules. So, and again, for him, the self is not something already given. It's something we construct, and we are constructing it right now. Now, if we're going to construct something, we need the raw materials from which we can construct self. And what are they? These are the 5 aggregates. And this is what we appropriate, upadana, what we cling to, upadana, in order to construct a sense of self. So we have body, in Pali, rupa. So this is physical experience. Now, body gives our identity a sense of solidity. So I identify myself as a physical form located in space, this space. And when appropriated, physical experience becomes my body. So my seeing, my hearing, my smelling, my tasting, my touching. And this is who I am. So then we have the next in the list is feeling, Vedana. This is the affective aspect of experience. So that which moves me, that which provokes a response. So the Buddha talks about the three basic movements. I am moved to hold and to become intimate with. I'm moved to reject and distance myself from. Or I am moved to ignore or be confused and doubtful about what to do. But what the Buddha is saying is all of these responses are appropriated as mine, and feeling tells me how I am. And then we have perception. This is sanya, and perception is the recognition or the interpretation of experience. So what gives familiarity and meaning to an experience? So perception gives me what I am experiencing. It gives me my world within which I find myself. So that's what I'm looking at. That's a computer screen. And that little visual bunch of rectangles, that's my audience. That's my audience. And this is perception. And you notice how feeling and perception act together. Feeling provides our response to what is happening. Perception provides what I think is happening. So what I'm responding to. So they work together. Then we get choices, sankhara. These are all choices and decisions to act. So these are appropriated to give me the sense that these are my decisions. I am the one who is making them, and I am responsible for them. Of course, here we come to the teaching of karma. And then finally, the fifth khanda is awareness, vijnana. So this is the most intimate one of all. Awareness, when it's appropriated, gives me the sense that I am the one who is aware of all this. So all these experiences are part of my awareness. And so now we can answer the question we asked before. The aggregates, the khandhas, are what we cling to in order to construct a self living at the center of his or her world. And that brings us back to self. So we take these together as self, and they represent our fundamental point of reference. This is what we talked about last week. Self is the place from which we experience the world. So I experience the world from here. It goes out. And it's also the place to which the world refers. It refers back to here. So we all have a sense, for example, that this is happening to me. And the me to which experiences happen is self. We have a deep sense that this is my life. Self is the owner of this life. So self is the reference against everything in our lives is measured. And the Buddha is saying that we use the five aggregates to construct that reference. Any questions so far about aggregates and things of this nature? Are you enlightened or just stunned? I'll assume you're enlightened and I shall move on. So let's look at we've got the five aggregates, the khandhas, and the Buddha says they're closely associated with dukkha. He says, in summary, the five aggregates associated with upadana, with clinging, are dukkha. So these khandhas, these aggregates, are really fundamentally important, because if we ask, well, what is the Buddha's project? It's to cultivate a way of life without dukkha. That's what he wants. I sometimes say that when I give Dharma talks, I open my mouth and channel Buddha. Now, the reason why I'm so confident about this is because I feel Buddha and I understand each other. And the reason for this is very mystical. We're both Taurians. And there's one thing that a Taurian wants is to be comfortable. We don't want dukkha. We don't like it at all. So I feel that I understand Buddha because we've basically got the same life project. Because this is what it's all about, is how do we live without dukkha? And this is why he's so interested in self. Because he thinks that our construction of self gets in the way of living without dukkha. But what he's focused on is not self and not self. What he's focused on is the cessation of dukkha. And in fact, in one discourse, he discusses how our view of self plays out, and then he gets to what he's really interested in. I think we quoted this last week. He says, previously and now, what I teach is dukkha and the cessation of dukkha. Full stop. That's it. This is in the simile of the snake, Majjhima 22, if you want to look it up. So the Buddha rejects the teaching of self because for him, self and possession go together, and possession causes dukkha. That's the logic. And possession here is upadana, that we usually speak of in terms of clinging or attachment. So, in other words, if we want our dukkha to cease, and the Buddha says, well, frankly, we do, if we want that, then what we have to do is stop taking as ours what is not ours. In other words, stop appropriating, stop clinging. And the five aggregates are important because this is what we appropriate as mine. And we use them to construct an identity that we take to be fundamentally real, against which everything is measured. And this, of course, in terms of philosophy, of doctrine, is the position of the Upanishads. This is self, this is Atma. Now, it's important to realize that the problem for the Buddha is not that we construct an identity. Sometimes people think that this is the problem. We're not supposed to have an identity. This is nonsense. Apart from anything else, the Buddha obviously constructed an identity. And when you read the texts, it's quite clear he knew precisely who he was, and he made sure that the people around him knew it and treated him accordingly. But he recognized this identity as essentially a convenience. It's a concept, or it's a network of concepts that helped him get through the day and function well. So he did not take this self as the fundamental reality and then try to bend the world to accommodate it. Instead, he adapted his self to be able to work within the world. You see the difference between those two. In the Upanishadic tradition, what's fundamental is the self. The Buddha says, no, it's not. It's actually the world. And there's an ethical response that comes out of that. That means it's not my job to make the world conform to me. It's my job to conform to the world. It's quite different attitude. Any questions thus far? Okay.
Blowing, really.
Sorry, Evelyn, is that you?
Yeah, it's just a bit mind-blowing. Just this, conforming to the world. Like, what do you mean by that? Just being adaptable, or accepting things like life on life's terms, being adaptable, changeable? Is that what you're?
Yeah.
Like.
Yeah, essentially adapting to what's really going on, as opposed to being insistent that the world adapts to me. Actually, given that we had a election quite recently, I'm political in my thoughts recently. I hope you forgive me, but I noticed that there are certain politicians who are overtaken by disaster, and they don't seem to have any concept of why. Someone who's been completely, thoroughly bashed by the electorate says, I did a really good job and we did great things for the country, blah, 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 and we're fantastic. And you look at these people and you think, are they really that oblivious? Well, they might be, because that's the nature of self. It's not my fault, obviously. I'm not wrong, so they must be wrong. You could say that the fundamental principle of the self teaching is the customer is always wrong. And you do meet people who are like that. This is where the self is particularly strong. But if the self is seen as just a useful construct, then there's much more room for adaptation. It doesn't mean you kind of give up and lie down and let people walk over you. That means you apply wisdom and flexibility to the situation. You adapt to the circumstances in order to pursue what you feel is important.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So in some ways it's an extremely pragmatic teaching. And you can see in the example of the Buddha's life, he was an extremely pragmatic person, which is why he was so successful. For example, the Buddha was, his politics were Republican. He came out of the Shakya Republic. But he had to deal with tyrannical monarchs. Now, these people were just crazy. And the two major ones in his time, Pasenadi of Kosala and Bimbisara, and then later his son, Ajatasattu of Magadha. Now, the person who gets spoken of the most in the discourses is Pasenadi of Kosala, because the Buddha spent most of his time in that kingdom. Now, both of these kings were his personal students. And you really get the sense with the stories about Pasenadi, the man was a lunatic, which is fair enough. He had absolute power. I mean, that would drive you crazy. And the Buddha managed to kind of steer him in the appropriate direction. He was very, very skillful. But it's clear from the way he set up his Sangha, which was set up as a republic, he must have loathed that monarchical system. He must have absolutely loathed it. But he didn't complain about it. He just worked with it in order to get some good in the world and try to get some good for Pasenadi himself. I think this is it's ethically. I think the teaching of not self is very pragmatic. So now, how do we practice with these five aggregates? In Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha says, "Here a practitioner understands, such is body, such its arising, such its disappearance. Such is feeling, such its arising, such its disappearance. Such is perception, such its arising, such its disappearance. Such are choices, such their arising, such their disappearance. Such is awareness, such its arising, such its disappearance." So this is his instructions for practicing with the five aggregates. And you notice that the practice focuses on the impermanence of the aggregates. So this takes us to impermanence, change. Now, again, this all links in. Remember that when the Buddha talks about insight, he talks about insight into the three universal characteristics of anicca, dukkha, anatta, impermanence, pain, not so. These are linked. So why is change so important? Impermanence. The Pali word for change, or what gets translated usually as impermanence, is anicca, where means not nitya. In Sanskrit, nitya, where nitya means stable, constant, permanent. So not stable, constant, permanent. Now, in everyday usage, Nietzsche refers to what can be relied upon. So we've been talking about dana, gift. You get mention of Nietzsche dana. This is a perpetual gift, what we would call an endowment. So something that can be relied upon to last for a very long time. So anicca, impermanent, means unstable, inconstant, discontinuous, and therefore unreliable, not to be depended upon, not to be trusted. So you can see the link between anicca and dukkha. When we rely on something unreliable, sooner or later we are disappointed. And the fact is, that we know from experience, we are disappointed again and again and again. Now, we use self to deny impermanence, to pretend that it's not there. Now, remembering that for the Buddha, permanent does not mean lasting forever and ever. It means lasting unchanged over time. And the Buddha is saying that which is permanent, well, that which appears to be permanent, can be relied upon. That which is impermanent cannot be relied upon. And self gives us a sense of permanence and the security that permanence offers. So remember that self provides us with a fundamental reference point. This is happening to me. And self lets us project this reference point to the past. This happened to me. And we can project it to the future. This will happen to me. And then we get locked into the sameness that permanence presents. So I didn't like this before, therefore I will never like it. Or at a more abstract level, you disagree with our eternal truth, you must be a threat. And any threat to this sameness becomes a threat to me, to mine. So self creates an illusion of permanence, and so it's threatened by the perception of impermanence. And this is anicca sanya, the perception of impermanence, which for the Buddha is absolutely central to developing insight. So we know that things change. That's pretty obvious. But why do things change? So do things change because I decide they should? And do they change in ways that I want? Because if that is true, then it would appear that self is real. Because self is the one in charge of me and my life. So of course the changes that self makes are convenient to it. But clearly, when we examine our experience, it becomes painfully clear that things do not change as we decide. They change because of a multitude of natural conditions that are beyond the range of me and my control. So things change because of the workings of nature, and my choices and decisions are just one facet of these workings. Now, it's important, very important, to underscore that for the Buddha, my choices and decisions are real and they are important because they represent what I can do to change my life for the better. So this is the teaching of action and its ripening, karma vipaka. But my choices and decisions are just one part of a much wider fabric of conditions that determine the nature of experience. This wider fabric and its workings is what the Buddha calls dependent arising. So my experienced world does not operate as a dictatorship with me as the dictator. It operates more like an infinitely complex republic with me having one vote. Now, it's a very significant vote, but it's just a vote. And as we track change and the pain inherent in change, our view opens up. We see the workings of dependent arising. In other words, we see not self. So the practice of tracking the 5 aggregates matures into perception of not self. In fact, in most instances, where the Buddha speaks about not self and emptiness, he does so in terms of the 5 aggregates. So probably most famously in the Buddhist world is the Heart Sutra, which is very important in Mahayana Buddhism. So clinging to the 5 aggregates, appropriating the 5 aggregates constitutes self. Letting go of the 5 aggregates, allowing them to function in their own way as part of nature, constitutes not self. Is that making sense? Shall we plunge forward? Oh, there's a zooming hands up, Jeff.
I think you said, Patrick, that the Buddha did define permanence as something which continues relatively over a relatively long period of time. Mm-hmm. Is that what you said?
No, so impermanence, something is permanent for the Buddha if it exists unchanged over time.
Permanence does.
Yeah. So impermanence changes over time.
Yeah. So if your sense of self might endure throughout your life, for instance, which is a long-lived experience, which you might call permanent with that definition.
Yeah.
But it doesn't last. So I'm just interested in why the Buddha is putting forward a definition of permanence when everything is impermanent.
What he's talking about is the way that we normally perceive. Let's say the self that lasts for, let's say, 100 years. Let's assume that I live for 100 years. So I know that the self is impermanent because at some point it falls off the twig. It's all over. So intellectually, it's quite obvious. But then the way I relate to it at a deeper level is, who is the self who's going to fall off the twig in another 50 years or 20 years? It's me. It's the same self that was born so many decades ago. And that's the self which is going to die in the future. So it hasn't changed over that period of time. That fundamental point of reference is the same. That's the projection, that's the inference, that's the assumption, that's the concept. But the Buddha is saying, if you actually look at the experience, you can't find any one experience, one aspect of the actual experience that satisfies that criteria. Everything is changing. But even when I can see everything is changing, still I have the determination to project back there, there's someone to whom everything is changing. So self has this kind of pernicious quality to it. It's not something we can ever get a hold of.
I'm still not clear why the notion of permanence comes in.
More hands. Because
I mean, if the self is being constructed all the time.
Yeah. I think he's just talking about the nature of human experience, that we do have this sense. Like I have this sense that the person sitting here tonight giving this talk is the same person who got out of bed at 6 o'clock this morning. I just feel this. I don't have philosophy about it.
It's a personal experience then.
Yeah, but it's a personal experience based on an inference. The Buddha is saying it's not a directly experienced event or series of events. It's an experience, but it's an experience of an inference that I take. It's a stepping back from the actual events that are going on. When the Buddha analyzes experience, and in terms of the practice, if you ask, what are we doing in the practice? We're trying to get down, we're trying to examine the nature of experience as it flows. And he talks about the elements. So he says, if you actually get your awareness really closely into what's happening right now, let's say you're doing breathing meditation. You start off doing breathing meditation with the assumption, I am being mindful of my breathing. So you have me, you have breathing, and the relationship is, it belongs to me. And that makes perfect sense. But if the samadhi really does develop, at some point the sense of this is me falls away, the sense of this breathing is mine falls away, the sense that this is breathing falls away, and all there is a series of physical events and the awareness that goes along with it. In other words, self has dropped away. But of course, as soon as I'm not paying close attention, it's back again. Oh, that was a good meditation. I completely forgot about myself. So that sense of self is characterized by permanence. That sense of being intimate with the actual flow of experience is characterized by impermanence. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Patrick.
Okay. Jamie.
So we're saying that the witness has a sense of permanence from one moment to the next, and then the self, kind of the ideas of the self change over time, and you can have those deeper states of like jhana where your sense of ego sort of starts to dissipate, but even through that experience you have a witness. And I guess, yeah, that's also a question, or like around the Buddha saying you need a self is useful, because there's a joke that's like, you need enough ego to know whose mouth to put the food in at the dinner table, so you don't put it in the wrong person's mouth, but not being an egoist, not being the king of the kingdom, not being so inflated that you're, the dictator of your realm. You have, enough, day-to-day awareness that's not excessively clinging. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, except the Buddha would say that this sense of an unchanging witness is also a delusion. He says if you actually look for this witness, you can't find it. This is where he separates from the Upanishadic tradition. So in the Upanishadic tradition, if they want to get down to what's really at the basis of it, it's the witness. But the Buddha is saying, okay, look, where is the witness in your experience? What aspect of your experience doesn't shift? So the witness is associated with awareness itself. And the Buddha says awareness is impermanent. It changes. It comes and goes, depending upon conditions. And he's got this whole analysis of the nature of awareness in which he says this. And he had problems getting this across in his lifetime. So there's one famous discourse where one of the bhikkhus is dobbed in by his mates, and they say he actually thinks that awareness is permanent, and it's awareness which is reborn. So consciousness awareness. And he's brought up before the Buddha when the Buddha just rips into him. Haven't I said in so many times, in so many ways, awareness is impermanent, it comes and goes according to conditions. But it's interesting that that discourse is there because it indicates how much this teaching was resisted, even among his own students. They wanted to believe this permanent awareness. And what the Buddha is saying is, look, you can believe whatever you like, but do you experience awareness with no change? And his bet is, or his challenge is, if you look at experience closely enough, you will see change. You will see impermanence. So he's quite ruthless in that respect. And even in his own time, even among his own students, people had this was blowing their mind. So not even awareness. What? And it is quite weird, you know, when you think about it. But this is what he was saying, and it is quite radical. And then from there you get the ethical situation where it comes in what we talk about as ego. So don't have the inflated ego and so on. And this does naturally segue from this teaching of not self. It's much harder to construct an inflated ego if you can see that nothing actually lasts. Everything's coming and going according to natural conditions. So it's not about me, it's about conditions. And that does have ethical implications. But the teaching is very radical. And for a lot of people, absolutely counterintuitive. Like this can't be right. It can't be saying this. It must be saying something else. That's the response that a lot of people have to it. Okay, shall we move on? Time is... Oh, another question. Tony.
Yeah, I have a question, Patrick. So if our sense of self doesn't exist, what about other people's sense of self? Or do other people exist?
What the Buddha is saying is you can't find it in your experience. So the background here is that what the Buddha is interested in is the nature of human experience. Now, that's all that he's interested in. So in Western philosophical terms, you could categorize him as a radical empiricist. He's interested only in the nature of experience. So, for example, he rejects metaphysical teachings like, oh, there's this metaphysical self. Equally, he rejects teachings like, oh, there's a creator God. Now, let's take the creator God one, which is scandalous for people like Christians, Jews, Muslims, people from theistic traditions, Hindus. Why does he reject the teaching of a creator God? He doesn't reject it because he says there isn't one. He rejects it because you can't experience one. So if there's a creator God from which creation comes from, where in the creation we cannot get to the creator. Like that's just in the nature of the whole thing. And so the Buddha is saying, look, I'm not interested in this creator because it's just a concept. I can't actually experience it. I'm not interested. And I'm not going to talk about it. And this is where the teaching of not self comes. He's saying, look, you can't actually experience it. So forget about it. It just gets in the way. But then he adds, in your determination to believe or to act as if there is a self, as if your self is real and this other people's selves are real, the only way you can do that is by appropriation. If you do the appropriation, it will cause you suffering. So if you solidify other people's selves, it will cause you pain. So why do it? What's the point? And again, it's both mind-blowing, but it's also extremely pragmatic. He's saying, look, it doesn't work, so drop it. I don't know if I'm answering your question or just blathering.
I think that was helpful.
Okay.
Thanks.
Daniel, you've got your hand up. No, you're not Daniel.
It's Jessica here. I'm using someone else's computer.
I thought it was Daniel.
This is not me.
You're a living example of not self.
I'm interested. I'm interested in the relationship between. I'm interested to know about the relationship between this not self, word self, and experience. So if the goal is non-self or not self, then you can't really have the experience because no one is experiencing anything, or you can't know you're experiencing because there's no self. So what's the point of experiencing? I mean, it's not what's the point, it's, and I feel like I'm getting in a circle in my thinking.
The point is not to get to not self. The point is to stop suffering.
Not, sorry, not what?
The point is to stop suffering.
Right.
And the Buddha is saying, if we appropriate, if we take something as mine that isn't mine, then we'll suffer. And how do we experience the self? We experience the self by taking things to be mine. This is my experience. If we do that, we suffer. So let's not do it.
Okay.
So one of the things that the Buddha is not a philosopher. He's not laying out the philosophical doctrine of no self. Later in the Buddhist tradition, they talk about this. Like there's like this whole Buddhist philosophy in which they're proving, no self or non-self or blah, 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 blah. But that's not the Buddha. The Buddha's interested in just what I want is to stop suffering. And he's saying, as far as I can see, self is something that I construct. I construct it by appropriating as mine, and whenever I do that, I suffer. So let's not do it. One way this was expressed by a contemporary Thai teacher, Ajahn Buddhadasa. He said, teaching this as not self as a practice, he said, give back what does not belong to you. That's your practice. Give back what does not belong to you. Do that and you'll be happy. And what is it that does not belong to us? Body, feeling, perception, choices, awareness, everything. Give it back and you'll be happy. Keep it and you'll be miserable. So what do you want? Do you want to be miserable or do you want to be happy? And this is not a philosophical doctrine. This is a practical strategy.
Yeah.
So if you try to overthink it, then either you're going to drive yourself crazy or you're going to become a great Buddhist philosopher. But neither of those would help.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, you've got your Zoomy hand up.
Yeah, I'm curious about that instruction, just give it back. But that claiming that occurs, it seems to occur a lot here anyway, that isn't necessarily predicated on a claimer. So to say just give it back, that seems to be predicated on a separate being to claim or not claim.
Yeah. It's what we're talking about, of course, is letting go. And letting go is very tricky. Because if we try to let go, we're holding on. It's like saying, relax.
Yeah.
I want you to relax now. Oh my God, I better start relaxing. How do I do it? And immediately I'm tense. Because when you hear the instructions, okay, relax. So you're doing something, and now you've got to do this extra thing to a sufficient degree that you can prove that you're okay now. Which means you're not relaxed.
Yeah, it seems like it's adding an unnecessary extra step. Like there's the claiming that happens or the relaxing that happens, but it seems like there's an adding in of a relaxer or a claimer, which isn't actually real.
That's right. And that's where it gets really tricky. That's where it gets so subtle. That relaxation, like not self, is that not that we do something extra, but we stop doing what we do.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to talk about.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
recognize it when it happens.
Yes.
But we can't claim that I did that.
Yeah.
It's like the experience. People, meditators will often say, they're meditating away and suddenly everything works. And think, this is fantastic. No, I cracked it. And then the experience never comes back because it wasn't them that was doing it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It just happened according to conditions. And this is the teaching of dependent arising. It happens according to conditions.
And Patrick, going back to earlier when you were saying awareness is also impermanent, but that ineffable thing that you're just talking about of, the good sit or whatever, that just the happening, that does seem to be permanent, that happenings. But I don't know, I'm going back a little bit to that earlier conversation and I'm aware of the time, so we don't have to get into that.
But that experience that you have is perfectly valid. And you must never think, oh, that's the wrong experience because Buddha disagrees. That's your experience. So from a Buddhist perspective, it's like, oh, this is interesting, investigate more. Like, what is that? What's going on? And the whole, when we get to the practice aspect, is what the Buddha is doing. He's setting up this framework and he's saying, okay, now have a look. So is there something that doesn't change?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, yes, sir. X doesn't change. Oh, that's fantastic. So have a close look at X. Are you sure it doesn't change? That's what he's doing. He's not saying X doesn't change. If you don't believe this, you're out.
Yeah.
Saying, oh, that's really interesting that you say X doesn't change. Please look more closely.
Yeah.
And see what you come up with.
Yeah. Thank you. Beautiful. Thanks.
And again, the Buddha's not a philosopher. He's a practitioner. The Buddha's philosophy comes later. It's after him. He's not teaching philosophy. He's teaching to practice. So let's talk about this practice. So the Buddha says, here a practitioner understands such is body, such its arising, such its disappearance, feeling, perception, choices, awareness. He goes to the same thing. So if you look at that, there are two aspects. First, clarify the experience. Such is body. So this physical experience, what is it exactly? This feeling or this concept, what is it? What does it do? So when we practice, particularly when we're practicing for insight, it's like we are interrogating the experience. We're interested, we're curious about the nature of experience. What is it exactly? What is going on? And in particular, in this section of the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha is saying, look, if you're interested in getting a flavor of self, clarify that which you regard as yours. So don't try to force it, but notice your relationship to experience as you practice. Is this mine? So just have this question in the back of your mind. And what you're doing is you're applying investigation to your awareing. Now, the investigation may appear simply as a sense of curiosity. So, for example, does this memory affect me? Does this desire affect me? Does this aversion, this dislike affect me? Why? Is it mine? Is this happening to me? So don't do anything with the perception. Just notice when it's there and what happens once you notice it. So be interested in it. You're not trying to get rid of it. You're just interested in what it is and how it behaves. So first, clarify the experience and then perceive the impermanence of the experience. So such its arising, such its disappearance. So this tracking impermanence involves seeing change itself, but also developing a broader view of what conditions change. So when I'm teaching retreats, I like to emphasize getting to know your distractions. So distraction is a change. If I'm meditating, then I'm distracted. Whoops, I realize I'm distracted. I get back to meditation. It's change. What conditions this change? Did I do that? Does it belong to me? And when we start to see change, or we get, especially once we get this wider view, we may begin to see the dynamics of change, what stimulates change. And we may start to recognize how little of this change has to do with me and my decisions. We may start seeing that things change according to natural patterns that do not fit my agenda. And so then notice how I am disappointed or frustrated by change. Did I do that? Did that happen to me? Or did it happen simply according to the natural flow of conditions? So when practicing not self with the 5 aggregates, and let's say just experience, 2 parts. First, clarify the experience, and second, perceive its impermanence. The fact that it changes and how it changes. Essentially, this is the practice that the Buddha is presenting. Shannon, you've got your hand up, which I didn't notice. So the impermanence is intervened and your audio is gone. Try again.
All right, hello.
Oh, yes, there you are.
Oh, great. Patrick, mindful that I don't want to engage in paradoxical thinking, but I am. Am I correct when I'd say I've got a self-concept at the moment in here, Zoom. I'm experiencing you speaking, Shannon, but is the self also non-self?
Is the self also?
Non-self, Anatta.
Yeah, what we would take, the Buddha, this is what the Buddha would say. He'd say, look, what we take to be self is actually not self. This brings us, by the way, to translation. I translate anatta as not self, not no self or non-self.
Yeah.
So all of those are grammatically possible. But when the Buddha's talking about it, he talks about it in terms of a something. So he says, this is not self. So this particular experience, is it self or not self?
Yeah.
What he's saying is, if you're making that investigation, focus on change.
Yeah.
And along with that, focus on who's responsible for the change.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Now, for him, and he's coming out of this ancient Indian tradition. For him, he says, look, to qualify as self, it's got to be you that's making the change.
Yes. Position. Yeah. Okay.
This is fundamental to the Indian view of self. It's also fundamental to the psychological sense of self. The self is essentially the one in charge. It's the boss.
Yeah.
So I don't have a functioning sense of self if I can't make the decision to stand up from this chair. The fact that I'm in charge of whether I'm sitting down or standing up.
Yeah.
Gives me my sense of self. So hence the suffering of people who are struck by illness, and they can't do that. They lose agency. The suffering of people in nursing homes, they lose agency, and therefore they lose their sense of self.
Yeah.
So when you're making this investigation, one of the things to be interested in is who's in charge of this.
Yeah, definitely. And it sort of goes back. So just when you're talking now, I've got my ego concept online. You were talking to me, I'm listening, but I didn't choose to engage in that ego concept. There was no volition, no non-self. So in that sense, the ego concept, the persona that I have now in consciousness, that's to Anatta, correct?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a construction project going on, but this project goes very, very deep.
Yes,
Yes.
and it's been,
Much deeper than
Beautiful.
others.
Yeah.
And of course, when you talk to the scientifically minded, they will say, well, it's evolutionarily necessary, otherwise we'd all be eaten up by saber-toothed tigers.
yeah,
Yeah, which is an argument. So it goes very, very deep.
yeah,
And it's not so much that we are producing the self, but the self is producing us. This determination to build a self
100%.
is incredibly deep.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you so much.
I think I'm done, and I think
I was just going to say, Patrick, we're probably about 3 minutes out from the end of time, but I just wanted to hand it over to you to see if you want to go a bit longer, if you want to finish on time.
I think we should finish on time because I'm sure people have got things to do. And I'm disappointed that I went blah, blah, blah for so long. So we never got the chance to actually try this out. Meditation, I can only recommend.